Welcome to the Sensible Socialist Podcast, a podcast for the rational left.
We need to unite and work together if we're all going to get through this. Sounds like socialism to me.
The amount of people I see talking about socialism positively is actually staggering.
Do you think, do you really think that a proletarian revolution is just around the corner in America?
Grab your pitchforks and stab your mayor.
Your hero, Obama.
He's not my hero. I'm
heroic he comes
idiot. If Bernie Sanders were president, right, and he wanted to bring the same ideas as for socialism into this country, do you think that we would benefit?
Yeah.
But I just told you Venezuela's eating rats.
But I just want people to have health care. I don't want,
Same thing Hugo Chavez.
Oh my god. You people have, worms in your brain, honestly.
Hello there, this is your host, Kevin Gustafson, and welcome to this week's episode of The Sensible Socialist. All right, so just a few notes before we begin the main part of today's episode. I've had the privilege of being on RT America's In Question news show a few times this last few weeks. First time I was discussing the Marriott worker strike, and then the second time talking about Elon Musk's use of government money. And it's really been a pleasure to be on the station, and I really look forward to being back. I have posted both of the videos on the sensiblesocialist.com page, so if you're interested in seeing what those are like, check those out. They're right on the page. I do also want to remind everybody that, like everybody else in the world, especially in the world of podcasting, the Sensible Socialist does have a Patreon page. You can become a sponsor of the program. And, like other podcasters, I'm not really necessarily doing this for a full-time career or anything like that, but it does take time to research, record, produce, manage the website, and do all that kind of stuff. So, any little bit helps, and will definitely be very appreciated. So for the few of you that have, and you know who you are, I want to give you a specific thank you. And, if you're thinking about doing it, there's obviously a lot of places you can do and a lot of things to support, a lot of people who need it. But if you find this podcast to be particularly helpful, please think about giving a few bucks. All right. So usually when I talk about the news at the beginning of the episodes, and this week's news was dominated by two big and correlated events. So the one that came after the first one was that Jeff Sessions has forcibly resigned from being the U.S. Attorney General. And he was replaced by Matthew George Whitaker, who was Sessions' chief of staff, but he's also been critical of the Mueller investigation, and now as acting head is actually in charge of the Mueller investigation. Rod Rosenstein was in charge only because Jeff Sessions recused himself, and so now that Jeff Sessions is gone, the Attorney General is now, under Whitaker, is now in control of the investigation. So this kind of appears to position us for the expectation that Mueller is going to get the axe sometime soon. But I think it's important to kind of put in perspective. It's been a very interesting few days seeing liberals and things like that come out in favor of Jeff Sessions, who is not at all a liberal, not even close. And so it's really showing kind of what strange bedfellows you have when times get weird like this. But to put it in a little bit of perspective, it wasn't until Nixon fired Special Prosecutor Archibald Cox after the, quote, Saturday Night Massacre, where a bunch of people were asked to fire him and didn't want to, so quit, that the sort of groundswell for impeachment began to spread in the Republican Party when it came to Nixon. So given the fact that we're likely going to see the firing of the special prosecutor sometime soon, it seems like that is going to be on maybe something that we're going to see in the next little bit. The second big event is going to lead us into this episode's main topic, the Democratic Party. So obviously the midterm 2018 elections were held on Tuesday, November 6th, and though we didn't see the big blue wave some had envisioned, the Democratic Party did retake seats of the House of Representatives, and without securing the Senate, so much less the supermajority to say convict on charges of impeachment in a trial. But still, there's been there's been a change in the national politics, and it will be more difficult for the Republican Party to jam through tax reform and other legislation that they've had and they've done over the head of the Democrats for the past 2 years. So that's all things considered a good thing. It's also related to the Attorney General shakeup and what it means for Mueller, because Democrats can now, since they had key congressional committees, they can subpoena the special investigator's record or the special prosecutor's records and continue the investigation if he's indeed fired. So that's an important step in sort of understanding what the consequences of the 2018 midterm elections really will be. It was not a blue wave, but it isn't totally nothing. So let's take a step back and talk about the Democratic Party, where social movements go to die. The Democratic Party is one of, if not the oldest political parties in the world. Tracing its origins back to the founding of the American Republic, the modern Democratic Party emerged in the election of Andrew Jackson, famed country bumpkin who would oversee the mass genocidal movement of Native Americans from the eastern coast of the United States to beyond the Appalachian Mountains. The Democrats were a fairly wide tent party, but as a historian described, the Democrats represented a wide range of views, but shared a fundamental commitment to the Jeffersonian concept of an agrarian society. They viewed the central government as the enemy of individual liberty. The 1824 quote-unquote corrupt bargain had strengthened their suspicion of Washington politics. Jacksonians feared the concentration of economic and political power. They believed that government intervention in the economy benefited special interest groups and created corporate monopolies that favored the rich. They sought to restore the independence of the individual, the artisan, and the ordinary farmer by ending federal support of banks and corporations and restricting the use of their paper currency, which they distrusted. Their definition of the proper role of government tended to be negative, and Jackson's political power was largely expressed in negative acts. He exercised the veto more than any other presidents combined. Jackson had his supporters also opposed reform as a movement. Reformers eager to turn their movement programs into legislation called for a more active government. But Democrats tended to oppose programs like educational reform and the establishment of a public education system. They believed, for instance, that public schools restricted individual liberty by interfering with parental responsibility and undermined freedom of religion by replacing church schools with public schools. Nor did Jackson share reformers' humanitarian concerns. He obviously had no sympathy for Native Americans and initiated the removal of the Cherokees along the Trail of Tears. On the issue of slavery, the Democratic Party was split. Its commitment to agrarian idealism and anti-interference mentality made them sympathetic, if not sycophantic, for slave owners in the South. As the brewing Civil War grew hotter, the Democratic Party became a home for slave owners and their proxy to begin to draw the battle lines of the American Civil War. As the North and South divide over slavery and the competing economic systems of agrarian chattel slave labor with industrial wage labor grew in general, so too did it in the Democratic Party. By 1860, the party split over the issue, and the disorganization and revolt of Northern and anti-slavery Democrats allowed a new competing party, the Republicans, who selected Abraham Lincoln as their presidential candidate, who, of course, won. During the war, non-rebel Democrats joined with the Republicans in pursuing the war, including Southerner Andrew Johnson, Lincoln's vice president when he was assassinated in 1865. Johnson would oversee and eventually, owing to the Democrats benefiting from white Southerners' resentment of Reconstruction, and after the war, the subsequent hostility to the Republican Party would eventually do away with Reconstruction by the end of the 1870s, after a tumultuous near impeachment of Johnson for his constant barriers to Republican Reconstruction, and following often more extremely violent disenfranchisement of African Americans led by openly white supremacist Democratic politicians in the 1880s and 1890s. By then, the South, voting Democratic, had become known as the Solid South. And at the same time, while you have a sycophancy or a protection of new racist laws against black people, specifically in the South, you also had no support and even animosity towards organizing workers out in the West on the railroads and in northern industrialized towns. But the Democrats would hold the South and maintain support for racist policies while railing against imperialism and overseas expansion. They fought for the gold standard, opposed bimetallism using silver, and crusaded against corruption, high taxes, and tariffs. However, the party was not in favor or supportive of growing strikes and organized labor movements that were growing rapidly around the country. Instead, they focused on demanding fiscal policies such as free silver and overthrew the quote-unquote Bourbon Democrats in 1896 when they nominated William Jennings Bryan for the presidency, which they then did again in 1900 and 1908. This is about the time that Eugene Debs is also rising, becoming a rising star, and growing more and more support in each subsequent election against William Jennings Bryan's more democratic populist approach, made emblematic by his Cross of Gold speech. In the so-called progressive era, the issue of monopolies and poor consequences of the laissez-faire capitalism of the post-Reconstruction era, it was Democrats who put the issue to bed, when during Woodrow Wilson's first term, progressive legislation was passed and put federal restrictions on key industrial projects intended to reduce the role and influence of monopolies. However, the Democratic Party, and Wilson specifically, was still a bastion of racism and xenophobia, and highly linked to powerful economic actors. They had deeply unpopular opinions about things like prohibition, among other things. When the economic crisis of 1929 turned into a full-bloom depression, the inactivity of Republican President Herbert Hoover had shown the consequences thereof, and nearly a quarter of the workforce was unemployed. Facing mounting pressure from the growing labor and socialist and communist movements in the U.S., Roosevelt and his Democratic Congress began enacting reformist measures that would stop the economic bleeding and reorient capitalism away from simply laissez-faire, leave your hands off, and towards a more Keynesian social reorganization of society through capital shifts via government intervention, taxation, and the creation of a modern welfare state. It was here when Americans first heard terms like Social Security and unemployment insurance and other mainstays of modern welfare states. Indeed, New Deal programs through massive government investment prompted by massive increases in taxation on business and the wealthy helped get back millions to work, build some of America's great wonders, and was able to be shifted quite neatly to war production, not dislike war communism just a decade or so before in Soviet Russia, after the attacks on Pearl Harbor in late 1941. Roosevelt would die in office in April of 1945, just a week or so before Germany would surrender, and it was his vice president, Harry Truman, who decided to drop the atomic bombs on Japan, not as necessary acts, but as a sign of strength to Stalin, who Truman thought Roosevelt had been too chummy with and wanted to draw a line in the sand between capitalist America and Soviet Russia. This unconscionable war crime, as well as the New Deal Roosevelt had created, and the posture both would set, would orient the Democratic Party after then as a capitalist, anti-communist, reformist political party. Democrats controlled the House of Representatives nearly uninterrupted from 1930 until 1994, and won most presidential elections until 1968. And until the 1980s, the Democratic Party was a coalition basically of two parties divided at the Mason-Dixon line: liberal Democrats in the North and culturally conservative voters in the South, who, though benefiting from many of the New Deal public works projects, opposed increasing civil rights initiatives advocated by Northeastern liberals. The polarization grew stronger after Roosevelt died. Southern Democrats formed a key part of the bipartisan conservative coalition in an alliance with most of the Midwestern Republicans. The economically activist philosophy of FDR, which was strongly influenced American liberalism, shaped much of the party's economic agenda after 1932. From the 1930s to the 1960s, the liberal New Deal coalition usually controlled the presidency, while the conservative coalition usually controlled Congress. The party became more a party of Northeasterners than Southerners. This shift would become more pronounced in the elections of John F. Kennedy, who battled Nixon and with Kennedy's VP Johnson. Kennedy and Johnson ran together because Kennedy was from Massachusetts, would appeal to the Northerners, and Johnson, who was from Texas. Kennedy captured the country's newfound corporate and media culture, as did his assassination in 1963. Having set the country on a course to the moon, as well as interventions in Cuba and Vietnam, Kennedy, and later Johnson, would show the two sides of the Democratic Party. Domestic policies with a goal of bringing more into the Democratic Party camp through the Great Society and civil rights, and imperialist war and American military hegemony around the world as ardent Cold Warriors. It put them at odds with the resurgent left, namely due to the decades-long conflict in Southeast Asia that once saw itself in line with the Democratic Party, but now totally left behind by it. After the resignation of Nixon and the economic trouble of the disintegration of the Bretton Woods system that he oversaw, the Democratic Party began to wane from its nearly 3-decade wholesale control on power. By then, the party allegiances had changed. Nixon's Southern strategy, attempting to move Southerners, many of whom carried over the racist and bigoted hangover of the past, outside the Democratic Party, their historical home, and move them into the Republican Party as the party of law and order, pulling yourself up by your bootstraps, and more traditional conservatism that, for the first time since it was enacted, openly questioned the success of the New Deal. In stepped into this fray Ronald Reagan, former actor and commercial star, and oversaw a massive shift in both parties. Reagan's success in the 1980 and 1984 elections would forever move the Democratic Party from a party of the New Deal and Great Society to a party, as Arkansas Governor Bill Clinton labeled himself, a New Democrat. The party relaxed its economic demands, still thoroughly Keynesian, while still speaking about a nominally progressive agenda socially. Indeed, it's at this time, in the early mid-90s, where you see the Democrats, in an effort to appeal to both liberals and fiscal conservatives, begin to advocate for a balanced budget, market economies tempered by government intervention, and an increased emphasis on issues of social justice, like affirmative action. As both parties became hardly distinguishable, and with new growing tides of tribalism in larger society, the two parties became less representative of two distinct political ideologies in the U.S., and more of two shades of the same party. Both parties, with the failure of campaign finance reform and Citizens United, shifted their policies to the donor class who pays for their elections. And money, not policy, is now seen as the best indicator for electoral success. The Democrats got a shot in the arm after 2 years of George W. Bush with the election of Barack Obama, the country's first black president. But it was an election that took place during the height of the second worst economic situation that had hit just a few months before the election. Despite vitriolic rhetoric about Obama being like a secret Muslim or a communist, he wasn't either. Obama oversaw continued expansions of the military-industrial complex, conducted illegal and unconstitutional drone strikes and assassinations, continued wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, bailed out the largest banks, oversaw the TARP transfer program, failed to urge for a single-payer healthcare solution, and instead went with the Republican idea from the 1990s, and deported more people than any other president had before him. In general, Barack Obama was the representation of the neoliberal version of the Democratic Party, a party that really cares about you, but won't actually do anything for you. So let's think about the role of the party today. On its website, the Democratic Party says, quote, "The Democratic Party is fighting for a country where everyone, from every walk of life, has a shot at the American dream." I think this is perfect. Note the judicious use of language here. The Democratic Party doesn't necessarily believe that everyone from every walk of life has a shot at the American dream, but it's fighting for it. It has to mention from every walk of life, because it doesn't have the economic base, but rather a confusing mix of racial, ethnic, cultural, and geographic individuals who just sort of feel a part of this Democratic Party. Note, it's also the case that it isn't to have the American dream. It's to get a shot at the American dream. It's an admission that they know, at least right now, people don't even have a shot at it. And it's also an admission that they don't want to ensure that people get it, simply that they get a shot at it. That's the position of the Democratic Party today. It's a party without an ideology, a party who is, at best, not Trump. But the fact of the matter is that Hillary Clinton, the ideal candidate from a party with an overall position expressed as the Democratic Party fighting for a country where everyone from every walk of life has a shot at the American dream, that's an ideal candidate as opposed to a party with the overall position, that elects a racist, lying, corrupt, idiotic, douchebag billionaire and loses many working class votes to that same racist, lying, corrupt, idiotic, douchebag billionaire. So let's talk about 2016 for a second. Anyone who doesn't think the primary was rigged against Bernie Sanders just wasn't paying attention. From superdelegates to debate scheduling to corruption of the DNC regarding money and campaign coordination, all of it conspired to deny a man who is still the most popular politician in the United States of America, who was then and still is pulling thousands to tens of thousands of inspired, mostly young people to get involved in politics. Bernie, in every poll, would have destroyed Donald Trump. But in the Democratic Party, that was too far. The Democratic Party is more committed to its version of social justice, which is something like making sure that there are more women or gay CEOs or owners, more business owners, respond to the failures in the black community with something like black capitalism. They care more about those things than they do at winning, at taking power, and really making some serious changes in our society. In general, all we need to know about the Democratic Party is what Nancy Pelosi, who appears to be slated to be the next Speaker of the House, said in response to a question about socialism in the Democratic Party.
But I have to say,
we're capitalist.
And that's just the way it is. However, we do.
And that's just the way that it is. Yet we've seen a change that started with Bernie. DSA, the Democratic Socialists of America, traditionally the, hey, don't you guys remember the New Deal style Democrats, have gotten more of a spine and more of an influence, and a new slate of candidates, embodied by Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. And they're showing that, at least among young people, the Democratic Party and socialism are not impossible bedfellows. But will this work? Frankly, I don't know, and I do have my doubts. The fact that there are only two parties means that usually they can bring in outside voices and make them part of the clique. However, where it appears to be happening on the right, where Republicans are being pulled more and more fanatically, it appears that the Democrats, partly in response to this right-wing shift, need to only consolidate their more left-wing members into the fold. Indeed, it seems Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez's support for Andrew Cuomo, among other things, makes the insurgency of these new DSA Democratic actors already feel a little muted. So there has been talk from places like Jacobin arguing that this insurgency in the Democratic Party can be helpful, and that maybe there should even be a socialist caucus in Congress. Maybe they're right. Maybe it can help. But if we look at the history of the Democratic Party, from the very beginning, it's been owned and controlled by, perhaps well-intentioned, but by members of the ruling class. The Democrats have never stood on the side of labor, really, but somehow have been able to fuse itself with reformist and stale, non-fighting union bosses. The Democratic Party has not been open or engaged with socialism because we're at war with it, right? We need to be good Americans, and so we are opposed to Soviet socialism. This has been its position throughout the entirety of its existence on the question of socialism. The Democratic Party has frankly shown itself to be unable or unwilling, or both, to actually be a party that can achieve big things for the right reasons. It's not since the 1960s that you can find a Democratic Party doing anything, well, progressive. And there's no reason to think that will change. What's really needed is to stop fantasizing about the Democratic Party and to work at something new. When Bernie was shut out of the nomination, he should have started a third party, not dissimilar to what Theodore Roosevelt did with the Bull Moose Party about 100 years ago. But he didn't, and we're seeing the results of that inactivity. We've also seen the consequences of that and the inability for the Democratic Party to even take back the Senate when you have, arguably, the worst president in the history of the country in power. In short, the Democratic Party is where social movements go to die. And what we need is not a reformed Democratic Party, but a new workers' party who can genuinely, openly, and confidently represent and hold the banner for the working class and to give us a vision and a program and genuine steps to work to build the new world that we want to win. Interested in hearing what anyone has to think about this, please send us an email at thesensiblesocialistpodcast@gmail.com. Go to our website. You can contact us through there. Find us on social media, Facebook, Sensible Socialist, Twitter, Sensible Social 1. You can find us on Instagram. And like I said at the beginning of the episode, check us out on Patreon and let's have a conversation. If you're interested in being on the Sensible Socialist podcast, please get in touch with us. Let us know what you're interested in, and let's see what we can do. All right, that's enough for me this week. Thanks, everybody. See you later.
Not to be confused with the GOP. He stands for a prevailing power to the people, and is for the vast majority. Why I vote Democrat, I vote Democrat, I vote Democrat all the way. Why I vote Democrat, I vote Democrat, I vote Democrat for my family. Always for the order of the day. President Obama say, give me 4 more years and I'll hide the millionaires. Seeds for the care you've given me. Why I vote Democrat, I vote Democrat, I vote Democrat all the way. I vote Democrat, I vote Democrat, I vote Democrat for my family. R is for the right to privacy. A is for ability. T is for the trend about democracy. Not to be confused with the GOP. Why I vote Democrat, I vote Democrat, I vote Democrat all the way. I vote Democrat, I vote Democrat, I vote Democrat for my family. I vote my family.